This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this tutorial I'd like to guide students through the study of Chapter 8 in the Academy's Classical Grammar course. As you can see on your screen, the subject of this lesson is pronouns. Before we get into the content of this lesson, I'd like to just scroll through the lesson with you and show you that this lesson consists of 7 parts. There are 7 parts to this lesson, so let's take a look. We'll see these parts labeled with letters. Here you see the letter A. This is part 1, and the subject is personal pronouns. We'll scroll down and we'll come eventually to part B here. And we see the subject is demonstrative pronouns. We'll then scroll down and find the third section, section C, relative pronouns. A little further, we'll find section D, the 4th part of this lesson, interrogative pronouns. A little further, we'll find the 5th section, section E, on reciprocal pronouns. Then we'll see indefinite numerals, the 6th part of this lesson, section F. And then lastly, we'll find the 7th section, section G. Here, definite numerals. So these are the 7 parts of Lesson 8, and in this tutorial we'll simply work one part at a time, and this may take a few videos so that we don't have one extremely long tutorial video. So let's go ahead and get back up to the top of this lesson. Okay, so Lesson 8. Again, we said the topic of this lesson is pronouns. And right at the beginning, here in Article 62, we read that the grammarian Buttman observes that, quote, pronouns cannot be so precisely defined in theory as not to admit many words which may also be considered as adjectives. So what we learn here to get started is that it's difficult to understand the differences between some pronouns and adjectives. In fact, when grammarians define pronoun, they often find that they can't keep adjectives out of their pronouns. So we see there's going to be some difficulty in understanding pronouns because adjectives are like pronouns in some ways, and it's hard to keep them separated. So we'll keep an eye out for any confusion related to adjectives and pronouns getting mixed up as we go through this lesson together. In Article 63 here, we have a good description of what pronouns are. Let's read this. All words may be considered pronouns, or at least to have a pronominal character, which are capable of being used as nouns, but carry with them simply a relational notion. So pronouns are words that act like nouns, but they don't express meaning like nouns. They're not names of things. They don't have definitions. They simply express a relation. They express a relation. In other words, instead of naming or describing an object, pronouns enable us to recognize it by some relation of definiteness or indefiniteness, of place, of kind, and so on. And don't get worried about these words definiteness and indefiniteness. We're going to study those ideas in this lesson. So we see that pronouns are words that can be used in place of nouns, almost as if they were nouns. But they have no meaning by themselves. They simply relate to other words in the sentences. They express a relational notion, or they express a relational idea. So that's a helpful description of what pronouns are. Remember that in Article 63, you have a good description of what pronouns are. Let's continue. A pronoun denotes whether the thing spoken of is or belongs to the speaker himself. The pronoun denotes whether the thing spoken of is the speaker himself or belongs to the speaker himself, whether it is or belongs to the person he is addressing, whether it is or belongs to some third person or thing of which he is speaking. And we'll understand what the author is talking about here a little more clearly below. Whether it is some object near him or near another, and so on. You can see these different relationships that are expressed by pronouns. In classing pronouns or putting pronouns into classes, the speaker, the person speaking, is called the first person. The person who is spoken to is called the second person. And the person or thing spoken of or spoken about is the third person. And you see examples of the first person, I and we, of the second person, thou and you, and the third person, he, she, or it, or they. So in classing pronouns, we class pronouns according to three different persons: the first person, the second person, and the third person. And we'll look at what these are a little more clearly below. We also learned that there are 5 principal classes of pronouns. 5 principal classes of pronouns: personal pronouns, demonstrative pronouns, relative pronouns, indefinite pronouns, and interrogative pronouns. So there are 5 principal classes of pronouns. And as we study, make sure you remember and learn the meaning of these words, these 5 classes of pronouns. You might want to jot them down and keep an eye out for them in this lesson. Personal, demonstrative, relative, indefinite, and interrogative pronouns. So in this introduction, we have a good description of what pronouns are, and we understand the persons of pronouns and the 5 principal classes of pronouns. Let's go ahead and get started with the first class of pronouns here in letter A, section A, and we see that these are the personal pronouns, personal pronouns. We just learned that there are 3 persons in pronouns, first, second, and third, and the personal pronouns are the pronouns that express these 3 persons. We can see here on letter A, we have the pronoun I, and it tells us that the plural form of I is we. The pronoun I, or we, is called the pronoun of the first person. It's the first personal pronoun, I, we in the plural. The second personal pronoun is thou, thou. And you may wonder, why are we using the word thou? That's like an old English. We don't use that today. Why are we studying thou in grammar? And the reason why is because thou is a singular pronoun, and it will help you as you get started with grammar to see that pronoun and understand that it's singular in number. It'll make things easier for you. But we don't use the word thou in modern speech. So it's helpful for grammar, but it's not something we're learning to actually use in our speech or writing. The second person, thou, which in the plural is you, is called the pronoun of the second person. And when we talk about first person and second person, it's helpful to think of them in terms of a conversation. The person who's speaking speaks about himself in the first person. He says, I woke up at 7 a.m. this morning. The second person names the person being spoken to. So if the man said, I woke up at 7 o'clock this morning, he could ask, what time did you wake up? You is an example of a second person pronoun. Thou and you are called the pronoun of the second person. And then lastly, the third person, and remember this idea of the conversation, if two people are talking about someone or something else, that other thing is the third person. So we have three persons in pronouns. We have the pronoun I, the first person, the pronoun thou, the second person, and the pronouns he, she, it, and they, the third persons. Now let's go down to this chart here and see the declension of pronouns, the declension of pronouns. And there's a lot of information on this chart, so let's make sure we understand what we're looking at. First of all, across the top here, you see these three names. Nam stands for the nominative case. Genitive names the second case, the genitive case, and accuse is an abbreviation for the accusative case. So English has three cases, the nominative, the genitive, and the accusative. Over here on the left, we see that the person is identified and it divides into singular and plural. So this is the first person, this is the second person, and then down here we have the third person. So the first person, singular, is the pronoun I. I in the nominative case. When we name the subject, when we talk about ourself as a subject, we use the pronoun I. If we speak of ourself, or if a person speaks of himself in the genitive case, he uses the pronoun my. And lastly, if the first person is the object of some verb, in the accusative case, he would use the form me. I woke up at 7 o'clock. This is my house. He is going to help me. These are the forms of the first person singular pronoun. In the plural, we have the pronoun we. In the genitive case, we have the pronoun our. And lastly, in the accusative case, we have the pronoun form us. So we, our, and us are different forms of the same pronoun in English, the first person plural pronoun. So make sure that you learn the content of this chart, that you understand how the pronouns are declined. In the first person, there's a singular and a plural form for the nominative case, the genitive case, and the accusative case. Make sure you study them all carefully. If we look further down, we find the second person, and we see it again divided into singular and plural. The singular second person form we see is the word thou, thou. In the genitive case, it's thy, thy. And lastly, in the accusative case, it's thee. In the plural, we have the form you, or we have an older form ye. but let's use the form you. That's the plural second declension form of the pronoun, of the personal pronoun. We have you in the nominative case, your in the genitive case, and you in the accusative case. This is the second person pronoun. And then lastly, we have the third person pronoun, which gets a little more complicated because there are three genders. Here you see mas, fem, and newt. Mas stands for masculine gender. Fem stands for feminine gender, and newt stands for neuter, or neither of the two genders. So the third person singular form for a masculine person in the nominative case will be the pronoun he. The genitive case would be his. He goes to school. His books are on his desk. His brother goes with him, the accusative case. In the feminine, we have the pronoun she in the nominative case, her in the genitive case, and her again in the accusative case. And for the neuter, we have the pronoun it for the third person, its for the genitive case, and it again for the accusative case. Then in the plural, we have no distinction between the different genders in the plural. We simply have the plural pronoun they, plural third person pronoun, they. In the genitive case, we see their. Notice the spelling of there with an EI is used to show possession as the genitive case form of the pronoun. And then in the accusative case, we see them. So they is the nominative case, if you're using it as a subject in a sentence. There expresses possession, and them is the accusative case. It's to be used in expressing an object of a verb. They, their, and them. These are the third person personal pronouns. And then at the bottom of this chart, we're introduced to a few other pronouns, the relative pronoun and the interrogative pronoun. We see who. Who refers to a person. It's relative when it refers back to a person who's already been named. As if I were to say, I love my son who helps me around the house. I love my son who helps me, who relates back to someone who's already been named. And then which is normally used for a neuter person, a person that's not male or female. We planted a fruit tree which will bear fruit in September. So who is used normally for masculine and feminine third persons as a relative pronoun, which is used for neuter pronouns. And interrogative means asking a question. And so these words would be used with a question mark to ask a question, like who is there? Or which would you like? These are interrogative pronouns, words used or pronouns used to ask a question. We see in the genitive case, whose is used for who, and we see for which, we see of which or whose. So even though who doesn't refer to the neuter person, whose is still used to refer or to serve as the genitive case for which. And then lastly, in the accusative case, we see the form whom. and which, again, for the neuter. So these words who, whose, and whom, you can now see what they are and how they're used. There are different cases in English of the relative and interrogative pronouns. And next we see at the bottom of the page the demonstrative pronoun. The word demonstrative means to point out or show something. If someone gives a demonstration, they show something to other people. These are demonstrative pronouns because they point out or show something. And we see in the singular number we have this, which points out something that's close to us. And we have that, which points out something that's not with us, that's further away from us. We say this or that. And in the plural, for this we say these. And for that we say those. So we've learned the personal pronouns, the relative and interrogative pronouns, as well as the demonstrative pronouns in this lesson. So that's a lot of material, and you need to make sure that you go back through this lesson and master all this content for our lesson assessments. Let's keep moving through this first section. In the grammar book, you'll always see these notes written in smaller print. It's good to read these notes, but sometimes they can become complicated, and it's better to come back to them later. So as you study the grammar book, make sure you always pay very careful attention to larger print, as we see down here at the bottom of the page. You can see when we come to the next article, Article 66, you can see the font gets larger. That's because we're dealing with the important lessons or rules of the chapter. The smaller print is usually meant to provide some more detail or help you understand things more exactly. But when you get started, you should make sure that you don't let these smaller notes distract you and make things confusing. Stay focused on the larger text and learn the basics first. We have just some notes here that I'm not going to go into in the video that go into further detail. And as I said, it's worth reading these notes and referring to them later. They may help you later on when you get into some more difficult situations in grammar. But for our tutorial, we're just going to move past these things and continue on the next article, Article 66. We read that personal pronouns, the pronouns we've been learning about, personal pronouns are reflexive. Reflexive. Notice that word is in italics. That's an important word. Personal pronouns are reflexive when the thing or person denoted by the pronoun is the same as the subject. So for Article 62, make sure you understand that personal pronouns are reflexive when they refer to something that is the same with the subject. So for example, if I say, sometimes I teach myself. Myself is an example of a reflexive pronoun. It reflects back upon the subject. It identifies the same person as the subject. The subject of the sentence is I. And I teach myself. Myself refers back to I, the subject. The subject and the object of that sentence are the same person. These are called reflexive pronouns. Let's move on to Article 67. Our reflexive forms for the nominative and accusative cases are obtained from the personal pronouns by the addition of self or selves in the plural. So here we're going to see what are the reflexive pronouns and how they're formed. We can see the first person, singular, myself. Just like the example I gave you, I teach myself. The plural is ourselves. We teach ourselves. This is the first person singular and plural forms of the reflexive pronoun. The reflexive pronoun. In the second person, we see thyself in the singular and yourselves in the plural. And then for the third person, we see himself for masculine persons, herself for feminine persons, and lastly, itself for non-living things. In the plural, for all three genders, we see themselves. Themselves. So these are the forms of the reflexive pronouns. We read a note here, to make the genitive case reflexive, we use the pronominal adjective own. To make the genitive case reflexive, we use the pronominal adjective own. And you see an example here in small print. He killed himself with his own sword. He killed himself with his own sword. Own is used to express the genitive case and show possession. So that's all for the first part of Lesson 8 in Classical Grammar. I hope that walkthrough helped you to see how the lesson is arranged and how the content is arranged for the first part of this lesson. Study this lesson your own. Use the tutorial as much as you want, but make sure you study the lesson on your own and understand all the things that I've pointed out here in this first tutorial lesson. In the next tutorial lesson, we'll continue with Part B in Chapter 8. God bless your studies.